Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening for the webinar organized by the University of Nigeria Medical Alumni UK branch. The title of the webinar is obviously GMC issues amongst international medical graduates and how to address them. And we have been very lucky to procure the services of a very highly experienced and professional in the form of Ngozi Edi-Osagie. My name is Nkoli Kanyabalu, and I'll be moderating this session. Just before we start, I'd like to do a few housekeeping points. It's for us to get the best out of this webinar. It's important that we continue to keep our microphones muted. And if you have any questions, please do put it in the chat box, and we will always pick up the questions as we go along and address them as we go along. Like I said, this webinar is all about GMC issues as it affects international medical graduates. And just a brief introduction. From the GMC Data Explorer from this morning, it said that doctors granted registration for the first time in 2020 was 17,220. And the number of doctors on the GMC register is still 340,233. And the number of international medical graduates is 99,000. And there have been very high profile reports that have highlighted concerns about the professional practice and regulation of doctors who qualified outside the United Kingdom. And these reports have shown that doctors, IMGs have always been proportionally more likely to be subject to an investigation by the GMC about several issues, and they are more likely to be investigated within the first 2 years of practicing in the UK. This is why the University of Nigeria Medical Alumni Association have put together this webinar, if anything, to try and enlighten us and to empower us, and hopefully empower those around us to be able to be aware of these issues and seek ways of addressing it. And without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ngozi so she can introduce herself and kick it off for us.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Is it possible to make me a co-host? I'll just share my screen. Okay. For those of you that are on, if you can see, because I've shared my screen. So, Colin, can you see my screen?
Yes, I can. Perfect.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So she said, my name's Ngozi Edi-Osagie. I'm a doctor who works in Manchester. I'm not an expert on the GMC, but I have done work for them for quite a long time. And so today I'm just going to tell you about some of my experiences and what I feel is a way to keep out of trouble. And so I'll just start. Now, it's if anybody wants to ask any questions, just pop it in the chat. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat whilst I'm speaking as well. So I've termed it How to Avoid the GMC, and what I'm going to give you is a little bit of background. What sorts of things are investigated, because I find that people are sometimes quite surprised about why they'd be investigated, what the process is. And so if you know the process, perhaps if you ever find yourself in that position, you know what to do. If you are in that position, what happens next, and what we can do to avoid the GMC. So when I first arrived in the UK in 1991, I got something called provisional registration. That's been stopped now, so there's nothing like provisional. You get registered, you get full registration. And at that time, I remember looking at the booklet I was given, Good Medical Practice, and on the front of it, it said, "Protecting Patients, Guiding Doctors." And I remember thinking to myself, who are they protecting patients from? This is the General Medical Council. Are they protecting patients from us? And after a while, it began to dawn on me that protecting patients, in a sense, from doctors who weren't doing very well, who they were concerned about, but that an ethos, for the GMC to have that ethos in itself was a worry to me. And my view of the GMC in 1995, I would say, was that, yes, I knew they were our regulators. My other thought was that it was quite pricey. Each year it came round and I had to pay almost £500. I felt they were quite powerful because they seemed to have nobody who could hold them to account. When people said the GMC, the first thing that came to my mind was concern. And it wasn't the kind of thing that you want to wrap your arms around. So there's a bit of antagonism, and you saw them as punitive, and you really wanted to keep as far away as possible from them. So many years later, has it changed? Well, some things have changed because they've changed their logo. What used to be protecting patients is now working with doctors, working for patients. They are still a regulator. They're still pricey. I think people still view them as concern. I suppose that's why I'm here today. But they are involved with giving guidance for things. They're involved in standard setting. And I think one of the best and most helpful things they've brought in the last few years is an ELA, which is an employee liaison advisor. And I'll talk about that in a few slides down. So why am I, so I'll just see. So why am I, so this is good medical practice. And good medical practice is the guide that will help us all to keep safe. And I thought I'd start with this because good medical practice is almost like, I call it the Bible of medical practice in the UK. Before each of my appraisals, I have a look through so that I'm conversant with what the most up-to-date guidance is. It's updated every few years. So this is a very different copy to the one I was given in 1995. And I think it's a good idea just to familiarize yourself with good medical practice, which should be the guiding principle for your work here. Now, I think, just hold on a sec. So, I don't know why there's a, hold on. I'll just stop sharing for a bit. Okay. Can you see my screen, Collie?
No, not yet.
Okay, just hold on a sec. I'll just. My PowerPoint just suddenly disappeared. Okay, here we are. Okay, here we are.
Perfect.
So I seem to have had some slides missing, so I just wanted to check that I was okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Thank you.
Okay. So yes, this was a slide I was missing because I couldn't find where it was. And I thought, as I said, I'm not an expert on the GMC, but I do have some experience. And my experience is that I have been a fitness to practice associate since 2000 and I think the year 2000. Yeah, since 2000. So that's a long time. I'm also one of the group associate medical directors at Manchester Foundation Trust. And Manchester Foundation Trust, some of you have heard of the term mega trusts. Manchester Foundation Trust is a mega trust. It's made up of 10 hospitals. And there is, by law, you can only have one responsible officer for each organization. It's irrespective of how many hospitals are in your trust. So we only have one responsible officer. And the responsible officer role is the person who the GMC liaises with if there's a concern. And they only want to liaise with one person. So obviously it makes it quite difficult if you now have lots of hospitals. So as I support the responsible officer in her role in looking after doctors who have concerns. So I meet with the GMC every 3 months to discuss all the doctors in those 10 hospitals who there's concerns about, myself and the RO. I'm also the head of newborn services for the City of Manchester. I worked on a project that looked to bring those 10 hospitals together. It was called the Single Hospital Service Project for Greater Manchester. And that brought me into contact with lots of different individuals, many who I would have loved to give a nod to the GMC. Obviously I didn't, because it's not just your clinical work. Most people worry about clinical work, but it's actually conduct and behaviour. And I also chair the neonatal critical care clinical reference group for NHS England in NHS improvement. So that's my background, and it's because of this I've got some experience that I'll share with you today. So as I said, these are the things that mean that the GMC, whilst very different to 1995, still has a lot of things that are of a concern. So that's good medical practice. So what I find is that obviously as international medical graduates, there is a concern because you're more likely to be reported to the GMC, it's said. However, people don't change when they come into work. There's inequality and inequity in our society, in the society here in the UK. And the same people who are making those decisions about how to organise care, organise resources, are the same people who are dealing with doctors at work in the GMC. They don't change. So if there's inequality and inequity in society, there's bound to be inequality and inequity in how we're treated as international medical graduates. So there is poor maternal mortality, there's unequal statistics in mental health, we fare worse in cancer. The pass rates in examinations are worse if you're an international medical graduate. So in my college, the Royal College of Paediatricians, if you are a UK graduate, you'll have an 8% chance of passing the postgraduate exams, and you have a 68% passing if you're Black or Asian. And this is irrespective of where you qualified. So even if you qualified in the UK, that statistic, you're part of that 68%.
Ngozi, can I interrupt you just a little bit?
Yeah.
We can't see your slides actually. It's only it's just the introductory page that we can see.
Okay.
The one that says your name.
All right, so I will stop share and then try and share again. Can you see that now?
Yeah, we can see fair to refer.
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. So as I said, there's inequality in the UK, and so it's the same people who are in charge of different things. Life in the NHS reflects life in the UK. So if there's inequality in society, there'll be inequality in the NHS. So a few years ago, the GMC were quite aware of the disproportionate numbers of doctors that were being referred to the GMC if you were Black or Asian. And they decided to do a review, and it was called Fair to Refer. It wasn't done by doctors, it was done by an external agency, but they came up with some statistics. So these are the, can you see my slide that tells you how many people are referred? So it's quite a number, and this has been going up year by year. The one that is going down is employer referrals, and that's because of the introduction of the employer liaison officer. However, if you're referred by the GMC by your employers, those referrals are much more likely to be taken seriously than any other referrals, because it's expected that your employer has undertaken due diligence. So the public, anybody can call it from the public. So in the last year, some of the referrals we've had are your neighbor sees you on your bike during COVID lockdown, rings the GMC, that we've had those sort of referrals. You steal your neighbor's bin, it could be anything at all. So obviously, a lot of those are not taken seriously. The other key findings that if you're a man, you're much more likely to be reported than a woman. So that's in my favor. We already knew about international medical graduates, but not only if you're international, so if you are Black or Asian. And the other subgroup that fare badly are doctors who are SAS grade doctors, so associate specialists and staff grades. And I would say a few years ago, when the GMC got a new chair, his name is Charlie Massey, because it's in Manchester and I work in Manchester, he was keen to meet the doctors who are being referred. He wanted to have a look round one of the hospitals. And so at the time, I was given the task of showing him around our hospital. And I explained to him the impact that the Hadiza Hamza case had on me. Hadiza had been a Black female pediatrician who'd returned from maternity leave. And I remember when the furore hit about Hadiza, thinking that headline, I am Hadiza, really resonated with me. And I felt, for me, it could have been me. When I was a trainee, I took some time out to do some research. And because I wasn't doing any on calls, I used to do locum on calls. And I went to a hospital one night to do an on call. And when I got there, the SHO, it was her first night. So although it was sometime in May, although it wasn't the first night for all the SHOs, her dad had died and she'd had to go back to Libya to attend the funeral. So she hadn't started with the rest of her colleagues. But because they'd been covering for her for a long time, as soon as she arrived, they put her on call. So that was her first night working and her first day working, first night on call. Then there was me who had never worked there before. So I was a bit nervous because here I am with an SHO. She wasn't bad, but it's just that she didn't know where anything was, and neither did I. And then when the night nurses changed over, the night nurses arrived, I found myself with two nurses who had never worked in the hospital before. They were both bank nurses. So there we were, 4 people in a big ward of children, and none of us had worked there before. Now, if anything had happened that night, so if anybody had crashed and we couldn't find the crash trolley, nobody would talk about the way that was set up to fail. I could see the headlines. The headlines would be, Nigerian trained locum kills patient. So I explained this to Mr. Massey, that, there are lots of things that set you up to fail. It's not just that you have doctors who nobody comes to work to make a mistake or to not give their best. And I also remember that when I was on maternity leave, I came back and was immediately put on call after I'd been off for 6 months with my first child. With my second child, I had a bit more gumption, and so I refused. I said that I wanted a period of induction, a period of just to reorientate myself back into work when I had my second child. So these things, the situation she was put in, there are lots of people who could have been put in that same situation, and it's only by the grace of God, I feel, that more people haven't been in a position that Hadiza was on. But it really, really resonated with me because, as I say, she was a Black female pediatrician, just like me, who had been in similar situations. And when I arrived, I remember that there was a paper. I came onto the ward one day, and one of the registrars, he had a Welsh name, and he said to me, each time I apply for a job, I ring up because I think that people might mistake my name for an Asian name. So what I do, I make sure I ring up so that I can sort of subtly let them know that I'm not Asian, I'm white, so that when they're shortlisting, they will shortlist me. And I remember thinking, really? Whilst I knew that there was racism, I thought it was be a bit more subtle. And then a couple of years after that, there was this seminal paper in the BMJ that identified that what they did is that they took CVs, they were identical CVs, and they gave the CVs different names. So some CVs were given Asian names and some CVs were given English names. And they looked at the possibility of being shortlisted, and you had double the chance of being shortlisted if you had an English name. Now these, remember, were identical CVs. And when I saw this paper, I remember thinking back to the conversation I'd had with my colleague with the Welsh name. Now I happen to know Professor Ismail because he works in a GP practice that's very near my hospital. And I met up with him and he told me the background of this. After they did this, he was then arrested. And he was arrested for wasting NHS resources because it was said that whilst people were shortlisting fake CVs, that they could have been doing other things. The BMJ at first refused to publish it, and in the end it did. And we know that this still goes on today because I saw a tweet, it must have been last week, of a nurse who applied for a job, and the comment from the shortlister, we copied in the person who applied for the job mistakenly, and the comment was, "We don't want another Nigeria." So this paper was 1993, and here we are 20 years later, and we're still in the same position. So yes, he was arrested by the fraud squad. And what they've recommended to stop this is to have anonymization of CVs, that an ethnicity should be collected as much as possible, and that it should all be monitored so we know exactly what's happening. This was a paper in the BMJ last year that looked at the pass rates of MRCPCH, so it's not just pediatrics actually. And it tells you that if you're a UK graduate, your pass rates are much better. So what is the GMC doing? If they know that Fair to Refer has identified that if you're an international medical graduate, you are much more likely to be referred, what is their responsibility? Because remember, they're there to, although they say working with patients now, they're there to ensure that patients don't come to harm. So you know what the problem is. Is there anything you can do? And absolutely there is. So one of the things they've put on is something called Welcome to UK Practice. Now, Welcome to UK Practice is a free course. It is. It used to be face-to-face, but since the pandemic, it's now online. If you go onto the GMC page, it's there. All the details about how to access the course are there. There are also lots of guidance notes and questions that you can access. My discussion with Charlie is make it mandatory. It's almost as if you have a patient who has a diagnosis, you know the treatment, but you then decide, no, you know what, I'm not going to give the treatment unless the patient asks for it. Even if the patient is sitting in your, has come to you for a consultation, you make the decision that says, I don't think I'll give him the medicine unless he asks for it. Now, half these doctors that arrive don't know that they're going to get into trouble. They don't come here to get into trouble. So it baffles me, really, why they do not make this a mandatory course. It's free. What I've been able to do is that in my organization, I've made it mandatory. So if you are a new doctor to Manchester Foundation Trust, before you start, you'll be given the opportunity to go on this course, each department. And apparently, according to Charlie, there's a problem. We call it mandatory, but I don't care what they call it. I think it should be made, whatever they want to call it, compulsory, whatever, for all doctors, because it's a really good course. And it might stop people from getting into trouble. This was the BMJ from a couple of weeks ago. And again, they're still set to try and help this. So they've set up this course, which is, as I say, that's my promise, that it's not mandatory. And what struck me is that I've highlighted the areas that they've said. So this is a BMJ paper that says, GMC sets targets to end disproportionate complaints against ethnic minority doctors. Now you can see how long this has been going on. And yet, I've highlighted, it says, ethnic minority doctors by 2026. So i.e., they know there's a problem, we'll sort it out in about 5 years' time. And it's going to eradicate disadvantage and discrimination in medical education and training by 2031. So they know there's a problem. It's going to take them 10 years. I just find that astounding. The fact they can even put it into paper. And there isn't a hue and cry. I only actually found this when I was reading my BMJ yesterday. So one of the things I'm going to do this week is to contact Mansag and ask them to write a response. Because to admit that there's a problem and think that you do not have the resources to sort this out for the next 10 years, this doesn't just affect us, it affects our children. My daughter is now a foundation year doctor. And so I look at things like this because whilst I feel that her experiences will be different to mine, I still feel that we're not as far on as we should be. And things like this illustrate that quite tidily for me, that you can think you can wait for 10 years before you eradicate disadvantage and discrimination. I think it's appalling. I've talked about the RCPCH, the physicians, and this is the Royal College of Surgeons. So this was in April. They published their diversity report into College of Surgeons in England. And I think they've concluded that you need actions, not words, because we know all this now. I think time is enough about what we need to do, what's happened, and people should just put actions in, really. So that's the state of play. So the next bit I want to talk about are what sorts of things will be investigated. So we know, so the first bit is to say, look, there is disadvantage. And so if there is, not to think that woe is me, that irrespective of whether I do a really good job, I will still be reported. Perhaps not. I think there's a higher chance, but there are things you can do yourself. So what sorts of things are investigated? So misconduct, so doing things that, and you might be surprising, things that are completely irrelevant to healthcare can get you investigated. Obviously poor performance, and for everything, I think it's poor performance that doctors worry about the most. And in actual fact, the GMC, in the main, from hospital investigations, are not really interested in a one-off poor performance where it's just bad luck. Because if you're a surgeon and somebody dies, now most families will feel, you know, the surgeon should be strung up and held out to dry. But in that theatre, there was the anaesthetist, there were scrub nurses, there was the ODP, there were patient characteristics. There are all sorts of things that might contribute to that happening. So it's not just about the surgeon and poor performance of an individual. If you have a criminal conviction or caution, before you can say Jack Robinson, the GMC will know about it because it's direct. Once the police know you're a doctor, it just goes directly. Physical and mental health that may impact on your ability to practice medicine. A determination by another regulatory body. So if the College of the GMC equivalent in Australia has found you wanting, then that will impact on here, because now if you practice in another country, you need to have a certificate of good standing. And whether that's fair or not, so I have I know a doctor, one of my recent cases was a doctor who was working in the Middle East, and he's gay, and they found out, and so obviously he was summarily dismissed. He was very lucky that he wasn't thrown into jail. but they refused to provide a certificate of good standing because in their eyes, he wasn't in good standing. Although he'd be in good standing here in the UK, he wasn't in good standing in UAE. And the other thing that can get you into trouble is insufficient knowledge of English. So if you're a GP, these are specialties: GP, psychiatry, ONG and surgery. I'm afraid I feel fairly safe as a paediatrician, but we do have our own a few paediatricians that are getting in trouble each year, and that's why I do the fitness to practice. But there are several thousand complaints that I showed in that graph, and 80% of them don't get investigated. So the GP on your bicycle during lockdown obviously didn't get investigated. The person who stole his neighbour's bin didn't get investigated. But if you're referred by your employer, it's taken much more seriously. And so the next thing I'm going to do is just describe to you what happens. So if there is an investigation, provide the information that you ask for quickly. Putting it off is not going to make anything any better. It just makes things worse. All the information that is requested from you, just supply it. Contact your medical defence organisation if you have one. And if you don't have one, one of the take-home messages from today is get one. They know the GM processes much better than you do, and they'll be able to help you. And if you're not a member of the defence organisation, get help from the BMA if you're a member. And consider getting emotional support or advice. Now, what I find, and this is a generalisation, I must say, but after having done the fitness to practice work for such a long time, and also looking after all the doctors in my organisation for the past 6 years, is that it does help when people sort of just fess up with everything that happened and access the support that they need, because it just makes the investigation much more, much easier to deal with. Much easier to deal with, it does. So if a concern is raised, it's usually raised, so within the organisation, you find, is it a local issue or a trust-wide issue? So drinking on duty, that obviously becomes a trust-wide issue. And one of the things you have to think of from the very off, is this worrisome enough for restriction? So we call it restrictions. Lots of people say things like suspended, but in medical parlance, it's called an exclusion. It's the same thing as a suspension. And we always prefer a restriction, because if you're excluded, it means that you cannot come to hospital at all. And most of the time, there are things that you can do in hospital. So we first of all set out, does it need to be that you're not in hospital? So we recently had, and I'll go through some of the cases and then you can decide whether, so it will illustrate some of your understanding of what might happen. Once you're now in the investigative process, the process that is used to investigate the doctor is called Maintaining High Professional Standards. It's a document that it's a legal document. It's used by all hospitals, slightly modified, and GPs. This is the document that's used for investigating doctors. Depending on the outcome of your MHPS, you'll then have a hearing, and depending on the outcome of the hearing, you'll be discussed by the GMC. If we're really, really worried about you, we will ask the GMC to do something called interim orders. And interim orders are where the concern is so high that we don't want you to work, and we don't want you to work anywhere else. So the GMC will put in orders that will say, this is being investigated, and while it's being investigated, even though we don't know the outcome, we don't want this person to work. So if you are reported to the GMC and there is sufficient concern, they'll write to your employers. So I get at least an inquiry a week, 1 to 2. So it's between about 70 inquiries a year of doctors who some concerns have been raised somewhere else. If you've ever worked with us, they will ask us, do you have concerns yourself? And as I've said, they will consider whether your practice should be restricted or suspended immediately. Once they've got concerns, they will then refer you, once it's been done, they'll refer you to something called the Medical Practitioners Tribunal Service for the interim orders hearing. And if the concerns that are received relate to convictions or cautions or decisions by another regulatory body, they refer you directly to the MPTS. So the timescales to deal with this are laid down in statute. So MHPS says that you've got to complete the investigation in 4 weeks, and nobody ever completes in 4 weeks, I'd say. It's governed by an Act of Parliament. So although the whole investigative process is quite cumbersome, it takes a lot to change it. There used to be about 350 cases a year, as you've seen now. When this MHPS was brought in many, many years ago, it was that cumbersome because there were very few cases. Now there are 9,000 and a minimum of 6 months now to investigate. And if there's a police involvement, it's even longer. So that's what we're dealing with if you report to the GMC. So what's the outcome if you are? So one outcome, which is the best, is no further action. They just write to the complainant, write to the doctor and say, you're free to go. I have further insight about this because I've been reported to the GMC. There was and this was by a doctor from outside our organization. They had a problem with my husband. They felt that because we're married, I must know about it too. And so I was put together in that report. Now, whilst I knew it was spurious, just being in the process of knowing that you're under investigation is really stressful. And so when I got my no further action letter, I was very, very relieved. So I've been on the other side. So I've been on the side of investigating and I've been on the side of being investigated. And that's why I say, please access support when you can, because I knew it was a rubbish complaint. Both our complaints were rubbish, but I know that they write to your employer. I felt really vulnerable because here I am in my organization. Who is the person responsible for investigating doctors? And all of a sudden the GMC is writing to my organization about me. It was a stressful time, but I was very pleased that it came to nothing. So no further action is the best, and it feels great when you get the letter. Speaking from experience, I can tell you that. You get a warning if your behavior is significantly below the standards expected. And all that stays on the GMC website for 2 years. And after that, it's not visible, but if your employer asks for it, then they will give it to your employer. So basically, it is available forever, really. And these are examples of what I've looked at. So one was unprofessional behavior, falsifying documentation, domestic violence, working at another site in hospital time, inappropriate billing, things to do with how you supervise junior doctors. And the last one I've put, because obviously if there are serious clinical concerns, that can also get you to the GMC. So what I'm going to do now is just take you that goal. If you do get into trouble, the one thing that you do need is insight and acceptance, and just try and help the process as much as possible. For when there is no insight, it is impossible to remediate the situation. And those are doctors where the outcome is generally bad. And in preparing insight, by the time you get to MPTS, because it takes so long, there are lots of things that you can do to show that you have insight and you've remediated, that the sanctions are more proportionate. So if you do ever find yourself in a situation, then try and help yourself as much as possible. So what's my take-home message? If you are brand new, please do the Welcome to UK practice. If you are not brand new and you have friends, relatives, whoever, you know somebody who is new, tell them to do Welcome to UK practice. Number 2, please register with a defence organisation. Now, it's not compulsory. I know car insurance is, and we all take out car insurance. This is your car insurance, because when it goes belly up, the organisation you work in will look after itself, number 1. That's who they're most concerned. Everybody has general NHS indemnity, but you need your own indemnity. So if anything goes wrong, you've got somebody who is covering your back and is looking out for just you. Read good medical practice. It is, I know there's a reverend here, and I don't know if I should use the analogy, but I always do. It is the Bible of GMC practice. And so just have a flick through. There are things there, and there are new areas every year they update it. I think that recently the one they put in was something about social media, and that always catches people out. Tell the truth, no matter how hard it is, because what happens is that when you're worried and you're scared, the instinctive thing is to think how to cover up what's happened, and it just makes things worse because the lay people on the MPTS, they feel that doctors should be, I was going to say whiter than white, but in this in this context, perhaps not, should be above reproach, which is a bit difficult, but they do. Connect with your peers, find somebody you trust to be able to offload and share, because it's really difficult doing this by yourself. And volunteer for roles. I say volunteer in a inverted comma really, because I'm only here today telling you these stories because I have put myself forward to do some of the roles I've done, and therefore have got experience in some of these things. There's sometimes I've just been in the right place at the right time, times been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and have just been there when these roles were offered up. But I would say that over the course of my career, it has made me, I think, I don't know what stages you all are, you'll all be in different stages, but I have found it really helpful to have been able to do different things and diversify, that have kept me interested in medicine. I think just doing the clinical work all the time, I would have run out of steam before now, because it can get really hard in whatever specialty you're doing. And that's it. So I hope you found it interesting. I think Nkoli is going to ask you, I haven't kept an eye on the chat, I'm afraid, but I'm sure there might be questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much, Ngozi. It's been a very insightful talk, and I'm pretty sure everyone has benefited from it. I guess this is the time now for questions. If anyone has any questions to ask, all you need to do is use the raise your hand function. But I will kick off with a question, Ngozi, if that's okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned, when you were returning from maternity leave and you were in an unsafe situation, just like Hadiza was, and how the second time around you had the confidence to say no, that you weren't going to do that. I guess my question is, how do we, or who do we speak to if we find ourselves in such situations?
So I think for me it was different second time, because second time I was a consultant. So obviously I had a lot more confidence, because I was speaking to my colleagues who were trying to get me to come back and do intensive care the very first week I returned. As a trainee, it would be almost impossible for them to do that now. So and that's why I say some things have got better. They've got better because there are rules in place that mean that you are setting up trainees to fail anybody if you bring them into a department after a long period of time off. So I think some deaneries have actually have organised keep in touch days, so that when you come into the end of your maternity leave, they actually have sessions where you can come back to the department to see what new things have been introduced, make sure that they are familiar with everything. So I know that things are better, still not great, but they are better in terms of that. So, and that's what I meant by finding, if you've worked here for a while, new doctors will probably, they must know somebody. I mean, if they're part of this, if they came from UNN and join your organization, must be people who will mentor them.
Yeah. I guess knowing our backgrounds and obviously the cultural differences, lots of people may view this statement, "I don't feel safe," or even flagging something like that up. They may view it as weakness. They may view it as incompetence, which obviously that's not what it is in the UK.
Well, that's why they need to come to those sessions.
Yeah.
They need to go to that Welcome to UK practice. And they need to be chatting to their colleagues who have been here a bit longer, who can say that feeling not safe is a valid thing to say.
Yeah.
It doesn't show weakness, it just shows that you are sensible and you're looking after yourself and the department.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Ngozi. We started at 7:15, and 1.5 hours, and the time has elapsed, and it's been a very interesting and inspiring talk, and we can't thank you enough. I'd like to ask our president, Ugonna, to give us a final message.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Ngozi, and thank you everybody for attending. I mean, I sat down here and listened to the whole talk, and it was quite insightful, quite eye-opening, and the stories were also quite humbling. Some of the things we do take for granted that could, you know, lead us into trouble. So I'm very grateful on behalf of the association for spending this 90 minutes with us. Thank you very much. And for all those of you who attended, thank you. And thank you, Nkolika, for moderating the session. I also thank Dr. Maka Achara for organizing this. So we'll be bringing this session to an end. Our next session will be in July, where we'll be having another induction program just to ensure that some of the doctors who will be starting their rotation in August will be equipped with some of this information we're getting. So with this, I'd like to say thank you and good night, everybody.
Okay, good night.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
You so
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you very much, doctors.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
You're welcome. Good night.
Thank you.